make a study out of it in Harvard, and nowadays it's almost a science, the science of making difficult choices. I'm not going to go through all of that with you, but I do want to shed some insight from her studies. Not all of it, I guess, is as relevant for this presentation, but some of it clearly is. And one of the conclusions of her report is actually that it's very clear that too much choice leads to less decisions. And there are some very interesting examples. Very simple test that they did. There was a supermarket selling more than 80 type of jams. And they took all the jams out of the supermarket, you know, put it on a tray outside, and they tested it. So one day they had 30 different jams on the table, and you could buy it after you tested it. So people were looking at the jams and were buying it. And the next day they put only four or five jams on the table. Now, it's a simple test, but they found that there was almost a 30% more sales when you only put 5 jams on the table. And this example is translatable almost through all sorts of, you know, everything that you sell or buy or do. And it's also very relevant for your vendor selection, but I'm going to get to that. Actually, one of the questions is, how many choices do you think you make on a daily basis? Rough guess. What? 20?
How many?
300? Even more.
Color underwear.
Yeah. Well, they actually, you know, this group from Harvard actually asked an average group of people, and so I guess it's not that much as you think it is, but it's around 70 decisions that you have to make on a daily basis. Probably for some people it's more than for others. But the revealing part also is that most of your decisions you take within a minute, maybe 2 minutes, and only less than 10%. Now we're up. And only less than 10% takes you more than 5 minutes, up to an hour. Now, clearly, you know, selecting a vendor is a choice that you will have to spend a little bit more time on. And we're going to show you a bit more. So, and this is my last slide on this Harvard research, but they also came up with a sort of solution, but at least some advice on how to make difficult choices. And even though, and this is maybe interesting, even though when Seuss came in uniQure, this wasn't part of our, you know, thought process and of the method that Seuss is actually using. But at the end, we realized that in fact, almost 80% of us here was actually included in our selection process. And it really works. One of the first and most important things you have to do when making difficult choices is you have to cut. You know, if you have a pile of documents you have to choose from, you need to find an easy way to get rid of the, you know, the big part. Mostly those are easy solutions as well. And that works. So get rid of everything that's obviously not relevant. Then the second thing is make it concrete. So by making your choice, at least the outcome of your choice, as obvious as possible, probably it's much easier to then make choices. I won't dive into that too much. The third very important one is categorize. Categorize as soon as possible. If you have to make a choice, you know, what magazine am I going to read today? And you have a choice of 200 magazines. Usually that's a very difficult task. But what shops do is they split it up into, you know, healthcare, technology, photography, etc. And then you automatically zoom into the area that you want. So that's another one. Condition. Actually, what it means is that the order in which you make choices is important. If you start off with easy choices and then move to the more difficult choices, you see that if a group is involved, stays much longer involved in that process than the other way around, or just randomly. Just, you know, as a sort of basis for the rest of the presentation. think about this. I guess you first need to know a little bit about uniQure. uniQure is different, at least from the companies that I've worked for before. It's about a 200 people size company, locations in the US, a big manufacturing plant, entirely new. I guess one of the first gene therapy manufacturing plants. It's large scale, industry scale almost. We have a good office in Amsterdam, actually 2 offices. We just moved into a new building with what we call sort of full service biotech activities. We have research and development, CMC, early. We have a little regulatory group. We have a small ClinOps group. What we don't have is we don't have an outsourcing group, for instance. There's something very specific about the company in the sense that we are exactly in the process of moving from a proof of concept, so moving from preclinical to proof of concept clinical, phase 1-2 studies. We're now moving into larger scale registry studies. So phase 2, phase 2-3, and rare disease. So rare disease in a platform. So we have a platform methodology, and that means that we're not focused into one indication specifically, which is always easier because of course you can be an expert in one indication, but we have multiple indications. And all of those indications are quite diverse because they're sort of rare diseases. I'll show you in what areas we are. Very quickly, liver metabol with our lead program in hemophilia B. And this is our biggest indication. It's still, of course, a rare disease. It's even more rare than hemophilia A, which means that probably your commercial patient group for Europe and the US combined will be around 6,000 patients. That's all. CNS, several programs in CNF, some Philippe-Aubé, we have Huntington's disease in preclinical stage, I'll show you that, and we have a partnership with BMS on our cardiovascular indications. So this is how far we are, roughly, and as you can see, we're sort of moving from phase 1-2, probably by the end of the year, into phase 3 study. That means we have to switch from to give you an idea, from a 10-patient study that we've done in 5 sites, because remember it's a rare disease. We're moving into phase 3, probably around 40 patients, but probably in 30 hospitals. And if we're not lucky, we could end up with 40 sites, so 40 hospitals for 40 patients. Probably they're spread over 10, 11 countries. So that's sort of the complexity we have to work with, and that's also very clear that we can't do it ourselves. I mean, if you have to run a study in 2 or 3 hospitals, you probably can, hire your own staff and do it yourself. If you have to be in 8, 9 countries, US, Europe, maybe even Latin America, that's sort of off the possibilities very quickly. So, just as an introduction, because we don't have an outsourcing group, we also didn't have the real experience in-house to know, what's next. So how do we get our vendor in-house? And I guess that's why we hired Seuss to come in.
So at this point, we did already have a relationship with uniQure, as we were about 9 months into an RPO, so a recruitment process outsourcing, as alongside of this, uniQure was growing. So we had an already in-depth relationship when we identified that there would be much value in supporting them through their vendor selection process with our team. And what mainly, I think, why the relationship was so valuable and worked so well is that we had very much a match in values, a very clear understanding of what the company was doing, and an understanding of why it was so unique in what it was looking for in terms of finding a partner. Because finding a supplier who wants to work with you is not so hard. Finding the one that's going to work with you in a way that's going to deliver what you need, not always what feels good, but what you actually need, that's a bit more difficult. We had already had a trust in our relationship in terms of accountability. It's a big process to support with a lot of high-level decision makers, and with the steps that we take, we have lots of ego and personalities in the room, so making sure that there's trust in us as a supportive team was very important. Then we also understood that the relationship with a vendor or a partner or a supplier, or however you want to call it, goes beyond science. It also has to do with the personal, the cultural, the heart decision, that it is a balance of what you know you need and what you feel you are going to be able to tackle problems together. Because anyone who tells you that, we've got this, there should be smooth sailing from here, you know for sure that can't be the case. Because you have to be ready to deal with issues together and problems from the expected to the unexpected. And because we were independent, I think that was one of the things that worked quite well. And we see that with clients that we work with in their vendor selection, is that, so the Dutch directness, it works quite well, because I'm also not afraid of losing my job tomorrow. I'm not afraid of saying, but what you're telling me now doesn't make any sense. Or if we ask the suppliers this, they can never deliver this. Because I am not part of a company, our team is not part of a company, so the independent devil's advocate role is easily played with zero consequence. And why it also works very well is this was initially for finding a partner, but finding and doing an outsourcing process and a vendor selection isn't something that you do need for years often in the size that uniQure is. It's something that needed to happen in a few months, and then that relationship was taken forward after. So it works, the model worked very well. So this is how our process works. We start with an intake, and that intake is really important because it identifies whether the understanding of what needs to be done and what the team agrees on becomes very clear. And not always when we say the same words to each other do we mean the same thing. Especially in outsourcing, I think that's anywhere, but in outsourcing that's definitely the case. We have full service outsourcing, we have FSP, which means something different to anyone else you speak, types of suppliers, so moving from large to a small group, and identified doing a market scan, which we took not just the suppliers you know, and the ones that come to these conferences and the conference you go to, but actually taking a step back and identifying over the total market who could be out there that we haven't identified yet that might just be the best partner for the job. So not always looking at the big name or the one that is here. An RFI, RFP process, pre-qualification visits, which I'll talk about later, our bid defense, of course, and negotiations. So this was the process which we followed over the 3.5 months that we did this. And what came actually out of the first initial steps were the decision factors. So as a group, it was a new team, so Marc was coming on board at that moment. So we did at that pop quiz the basics, the aspiration, the goal, the playing field, and how we were going to win. And we had everyone individually from their functions. So we were with the Chief Medical Officer, with VP Clinical Affairs, Global Project Manager as well, across the board, individuals who have different levels of drivers and things that are important, and put them all together to make sure that together we were aligned and united, because that alignment helps the process later. There's nothing more frustrating. I worked at Icon Clinical Research. It's nothing more frustrating than being in an RFP process and having discussions with the different clients that actually everyone wants something different. How are you supposed to give someone what they want, or a company what they want, if actually the internal agreement is not there? So what you end up doing is selling, I can do anything, and later there's always a group disappointed. So we made sure initially that we were aligned and we were speaking the same language, all the same language, same definitions, and that we agreed how to move forward.
And this is a lot of theory, for sure, but what it really did for the uniQure team is, and it was a relatively small team, we're talking about 10, 15 people working in clinical. In the beginning, we actually thought, we had a quick chat about it amongst ourselves, and we said, what do we need? And after 5 minutes, we sort of, I think we all agree. I think that's what we need. So we were like, what is Seuss then doing when they come in? Because we know what we want. But actually, by having someone sort of outside your group and asking, direct but very honest questions, we realized very quickly that we didn't agree at all. One thing is, what are core competencies? Because we decided, within uniQure, we wanna keep our core competencies in-house, and you hear that a lot, and we're gonna outsource the rest. And then you talk to a regulatory person, and you say, well, what's core competency? And that person will say, well, it's regulatory. And then you ask a clinical person, they said, what's core competency? They say, well, it's clinical, obviously. So it really depends on who you talk to, in the morning or in the evening, with a beer or not. And that's where I guess the value of Seuss for us actually was very, very beneficial. It's also to show you the mirror. It's like, hey guys, this is you. So it's not a harmonized, but they're all very enthusiastic, passionate, I guess, like in your companies as well. So they all are very opinionated. They have a different history of running studies. So different experience with different vendors. So that's sort of the practice for us.
Thanks, Marc. And we spent quite a bit of time, and Marc's going to talk about that later, about the time quality cost. So when we make decisions on what is important, we do it in our daily lives quite easily. When you want to go buy pizza or eat pizza, we make decisions, are we going to spend a lot of money or a lot of time, or we want high quality? And we do that without thinking. And all of a sudden there's a few million in play, and the product is your baby, and that question becomes a lot more complex. You want it all in every area. So we really spent a lot of time making sure that as a group, if we were going to be individually making those 70 decisions a day, of which at least 20 have to do with this trial, is everyone going to choose the same driver? Because if you're not, you're demanding from a supplier to do it all, and they cannot do it. And you, at least part of your group, will be disappointed. I think you're next. Yeah.
So very quickly, and this was after the first workshop, I think we identified the sort of general considerations. What is for uniQure and what is for selecting the vendor? What are the most important sort of basic fundamentals? And clearly, I think like with other smaller companies, the flexibility is very important. And that's why, and that's what I referred to just now, keeping the core competencies in-house, and therefore, if you need to scale up, just hire more people through a CRO, through a service organization, for uniQure works. I touched upon, personal and practical preferences. People think they want to expand in-house because they like the topic. That's fine, at least as you agree with the whole team. We didn't want to become a large, or how do you say, we didn't want to set up a big, heavy quality system, with more than 160 procedures that you have to start writing and maintaining and checking and QCing. Because that only in itself requires probably 2 or 3 full-time employees. And that's clearly something we identified not as a core competency. But as you know, once you enter into the clinical area, you have to comply with GCP, and all the rules apply. It's like building an airplane. Suddenly you need to document everything. I mean, everything. So that's what we didn't want to do. And that's, I think, in general, it's for all companies, but especially if you run studies in rare diseases, you don't have a lot of investigators to choose from, because there are only a few investigators who know about that study. So those investigators you want to cherish, you want to have your personal contact with. So one thing that really came out of, the basics, I would say, is that we want to have immediate contact and want to remain in immediate contact with the sites. And of course, if you hire in a CRO with CRAs who actually do the monitoring of your study, etc., they will spend time on those sites. But if there are issues, we wanted to be involved directly. And that did generate some, issues later on. Oh, sorry, just back, yeah. Why did I do this? Because if you have to take away something out of this presentation, it's this. Probably you've seen something like this before. It's the project management triangle, where you have your speed, where you have your quality, and you have your costs. I like this one much better. It's much simpler, because you can only have two. You can only have two of those elements. So either you have fast and cheap, then it won't be good, or you have fast and good, and it won't be cheap. And you can do, it works. It's very simple. But you have to convince your senior management at all times that it only works like this. So if you want to cut corners, if you want to be fast and good, you will have to pay a lot of money to get it. If you, and you can make every combination you like, and it always works. Okay. Yeah. Another thing that is, I guess, quite typical for rare disease, biotech, but certainly for gene therapy, is this. The focus for our studies is entirely in the beginning. I would say if you apply the 80-20 rule, well, 80% is upfront, and then 20% is after dosing, because it's a one-time dosing. You only treat patients one time. It's one infusion, and then it's just follow-up for another 15 years. So, and those are the rules for gene therapy. I mean, it's not like other studies. It's a big commitment. It's a very long commitment to patients, to investigators, so you have to build a trustworthy relationship with a vendor, probably even much more than with other studies. Because you have to follow those patients for 15 years. There's no way getting out of it. Now, so I talked about the single dose, and it means that it's gene therapy, so it's extremely new. Nobody knows about it. I'm going to share you a little story about an issue we had. There are new committees that are normally when you submit a study to regulatory authorities, they have a group who look at your protocol, who look at your safety, who look at your efficacy, etc., and then they come back with a recommendation. Now, for gene therapy, there's another group. So there's what we call a GMO or an ATMP group in every single country you go to, and they look at the specific gene therapy issues, like viral infectivity or spreading or shedding or how you want to know it. So it's the same group who also looks at corn, modified corn, for instance. So there's not a lot of knowledge about clinical studies in that group. So the first study we submitted to this group, I won't mention the country, we said, it's a pilot study in this and this product with 3 patients, and then only after 3 months we get a response back like, yeah, okay, we like this, we don't like that, but what we don't want is we do not agree that you do this study only in pilots. And we were like, pilots? But it's really the pilot study, so it's the sort of initial study that they didn't understand. So they thought this study, and that's why we were delayed with 3 or 4 months, just because there was no understanding at all, because it's really new to them. So, and this is just one example, but I can tell you a lot of other examples we came across. So it's not that other people know much more than you do, no, it's totally the other way around. But that's also the big challenge we had in the CRO selection, because obviously, if we were the experts and then we hire a CRO to do, a lot of the work for us, will they be the experts then? Because normally that's what they are, and that's what they also advocate to us. So, can you, yeah. I mentioned the triangle. And that leads us, all of this led us actually to some conclusions. We don't want to micromanage because we simply don't have the staff, but we do want to keep proper oversight, and that's also a requirement, of course. Somehow you need to convey that to CROs, that's how you want to do it. Of course, we want quality, but the focus clearly for us was on speed. You know, we're a biotech, we have limited funds, so we know when the volume of funds is lowering, we know how long we can last, so we need to get that study done fast. And more emphasis than normal studies and normal companies. And then there's of course the trust and check component. I've been in the area for quite a while, so I know that trust is good, but checking is better. So, and this is a bit in contradictory. Actually, this was a finance thing, but didn't. Okay, well, actually, there was a financial thing here that says, you know, very expensive, not so expensive, or you know, do you have money or not? And we were actually willing to put enough money into it to make all the other two happen. And this is then what it looks like. So if you look at the outsourcing model, it's different from what CROs are used to. Because what we suggested, looking at Perry, what we suggested actually is that we know that the workload for the study is mainly in the beginning because of all the reasons I mentioned. And then once we have the patients dosed, it's just a sort of follow-up component of the study anymore, because there won't be any medical intervention, there will be some blood drawing, but you know, that will rapidly go away until we have just a sort of safety follow-up protocol, almost like a registry type of study. And that's kind of difficult to explain to CROs. But also normally it doesn't fit into their model of how they want to run a study. Because usually they want to be involved from the early beginning, very heavily. They want to be responsible for startup, for regulatory submissions, for you name it. And what we were asking is, we want to be in the lead in the beginning, and then more or less from this point onwards, our responsibility, so the uniQure responsibility will go down. Our workload should go down, so we can do the next study. And then the CRO will pick up and just, you know, continue their workload or responsibilities from that point on.
So as I said, we started with a market scan, so we had a very, very big pool, and I will show you more about those numbers in a moment. But what we identified was that there was no perfect candidate. There was never going to be the perfect. So we just calmly decided that for every decision we made, we're going to have to consider contingency planning. We also had an additional complexity, as Marc showed earlier, with that we weren't just looking initially for a Hem B or a hemophilia vendor, but also for different therapeutic areas. And with the construction of how uniQure was in the infrastructure, dependent on the therapeutic area, they needed a different type of vendor because of how the infrastructure internally was and the support and the oversight, etc., we could give. Therefore, we had quite a broad selection because we identified up front that we may be on two different legs, searching for two different things. We identified 7 criteria. So out of these workshops, we together identified what were going to be the biggest risks for our study, and we don't like to say that we ever have any weaknesses, but what are the weaknesses we have internally that we can utilize a partner that can strengthen that, and what is going to be critical for this study so that who can work in a way that would show things like speed. So if you need a company to work quickly, there are going to be some identifying factors to allow them to do that. If they are currently already very understaffed and very full, it's not going to be possible for them to give you a full team tomorrow. They just can't. What you can look at is how their recruitment arm is set up. What you can look at is how they keep their staff internally. One suggestion, stop asking about turnover of staff. The answer is rarely correct, truthful, or valuable. But you can understand how do they get people on board. So what is the thought process? How is their employer branding? What is their reputation on the market? And that was helpful that Seuss can give some of that insight because of our recruitment arm. But it is also to think about, if you need someone to be quick, what are they going to do more quickly than another? And if that has to do with staff, it has to do with experience. So therapeutic area experience, sure, that's important. But if someone's coming right off a study off of a competitor of yours or who has very direct relationships with those investigators, you are going to be able to piggyback off of that relationship. So speed can be identified in specific selection criteria that can give you that. And the rest I'm going to do out of the top of my head. So we identified 7 selection criteria which we weighted. So we identified what were the most important. Country coverage. uniQure had a very clear focus also wanting to be visible, strong in the US, which meant we had to have as well a vendor who had a strong infrastructure there. Real-time data, and this was important specifically to everyone wants to know. We all feel comfortable when we can log into a portal and see exactly what's happening, right? We have data, we feel comfortable, we can talk about what's really going on. Many suppliers are not able to do that yet or have very pretty portals but don't actually deliver that data yet. And because it's possible with gene therapy studies to actually see at the moment what is going on and what are the results, we want to know. And it's not just uniQure wants to know, it's also shareholders that wants to know. It's also, so this demand for real-time data was very, very visible and created a very heavy load on the current team with previous activities with suppliers that did not give that. Therapeutic area expertise, again with a visibility on speed. We did not need a group who was needing to build relationships in these areas. We needed someone who was in the hotbed already. So those were the 3 most heavily weighted throughout the process. We identified that in the workshop and we continued that throughout. These were the most important things for us. We also had things like quality management system. Marc said earlier, we're not going to create a bulk quality team, so we did need that quality management system and support and structure and reporting to be strong. Staff satisfaction, and all of these are great headers, but we had very specific metrics that we measured to identify how that was shown. But staff satisfaction we saw in reputation, in number of jobs open, in different types of things. How are they rewarding people? What is their internal growth structure for career development? Because for us, because it's a long study and because primarily a lot of the fun work, which people are in clinical development to do, was being done a lot by uniQure. So you needed to have a company that was going to create as much of a stable environment for them as possible, because the work wasn't super exciting if you're really only getting fully on board once dosing has already happened. Experience in gene therapy, actually it's interesting because this one started at the top. It's here at 6. These 2 that ended up at the bottom, the gene therapy experience and adaptable service model, started fully at the top, and someone needed to be an expert. Well, we identified the expert was the uniQure team, and did they really need to have a supplier that was going to be an expert? Well, we decided no. We did want them to have being able to work in that environment. It's a different type of trial than a phase 3 global study, and we wanted them to make sure that they understood the trials, tribulations, and the way they would need to run the group. The adaptable service model has mainly to do with culture. I think that we all think we're easy until our partner says we're not. If I argue with my husband, it's never my fault. It's the same thing with this. We needed to have a partner that was going to understand the passion that is within uniQure for the science, the passion when it's going wrong, but also the honesty and directness to share that communication as much as possible. So not 16 different layers to get to the person who's actually talked to your investigator, because we needed to know when it happened at that moment, and not when it's gone through 6 different levels of management to get to the uniQure team. We have the man doing this one.
Yeah. A big discussion for us, being a 200 sort of more or less staff company. We know that the turnover for our studies, the projected studies at the time, was actually 15 million a year, so roughly 45 million in total. And if you then compare that to, for instance, the turnover of some of the available CROs that are out there, you know, it's really a huge difference. We're talking about 4 billion compared to, what is it, 5 million, 3 million. And then if you compare that with our expected contract value, it's kind of obvious that we're not really critically important for Quintiles. Not in terms of money, not in terms of contract value. Yes, we are interesting, very interesting for Quintiles because we are the first gene therapy company. So from a PR sort of image point of view, they were very interested in actually doing this study or these studies for us. But then if you start to drill down a bit deeper, you realize that, you know, it sort of ends after the business development. So once the contract is signed, you're just one of the studies in their huge portfolio. Sometimes it can work actually, because on the other side, what you have is you need actually a CRO with global coverage. You need a CRO who has experience in GMO submissions, for instance, you know, in this you know, gene therapy typical submissions. Usually you don't find that kind of experience in very small CROs. So it's a balance. You have to find the balance of size. And that's why we had this, you know, weighted selection criteria with the top 3 in there, and then, you know, drilling down further.
I think what was really important here was the categorization. So we had very, very many suppliers we could look at if we looked at just our initial weighted selection criteria. But there was also a sense of we are important enough to work with the biggest companies and they know what they're doing, right? Because they've been doing this for many years and they're big and they're stable. But on the other hand, everyone wants to be treated as very, very important. So taking the numbers, which is what we did an analysis of all of the revenue of all of the CROs and compared that to what uniQure was expecting to spend. So in reality, how much clout do you have when, let's be honest, when the problems really start to get an issue and you need to be able to pull on someone's tie or shirt strings to say, and now something needs to change. So it was a good discussion. At this point, we were at the RFI, RFP. We went from many, many possible suppliers and not unalignment, but not yet aligned as a team. So at this moment, we were aligned, we know what we're looking for, and we had categorized these groups. So from the market scan, we scanned 150 CROs. This is Seuss work. We took, as we said, the top 3 selection criteria. We took size into consideration. We took reputation into consideration, and we limited from these 150 potential CROs and sent the RFI to 16 CROs to initially identify whether the CROs we thought had the right experience would have the right experience to talk specifically about being a partner for uniQure. From that, we sent out the RFP to 8 CROs, which we'll talk about later. Do an RFI, RFP, a request for information, a request for proposal. The request for information was purely for the companies that we had not interacted a lot with in the past, just to get a general picture, what they are, what are they doing. The RFP was very specifically included budget and a strict budget on our end in order to make sure we could compare as much as possible apples with apples. So one is company-wide scan, and the next is actually if we were going to work on a project together, what would it cost? How much time? What issues do you see with us? And this is what Seuss does as a coordination administration and analyzes all that data, because it sounds so easy when I talk about it this way, but it's a heavy weight on a team that is not focused on coordinating and administrating all of this. But it's very valuable because it gives you the data you're looking for with a non-emotional, yeah, but he calls me every day, so I might as well send him the RFP, and actually spending time evaluating and bringing that data to light and showing you what is actually in these different RFPs.
What specifically for, I guess, for uniQure, and that also came out of the initial work groups, sort of the days that we spent, is to ask the right questions, because there are standard questionnaires, you know, for RFPs, RFIs, etc. but you tend to forget some of the, well, you find out that's critical only afterwards. But that's also where I think we got some really good input. I mean, if you've done this 10 times or 20 times, then you know what questions to ask, because you know you forgot it in the first few that you send out. And I think we asked all the right questions.
Didn't make any mistakes, of course. Pre-qualification visit. This is actually something that I suggest to every client, but very rare do. And Marc was so this is what I really want to do. So brought the idea. Actually, before the bid defense, and if I may repeat your words, said I don't want to get a feeling about this company only when they come to visit me at a bid defense, because they are nervous and they are giving a show because they've practiced that show. So to be able to really understand who the partner is who you'll be dealing with for the next few years, I want to go visit them. So we coordinated that. Everyone had also evaluation sheets. However, it was much more informal. So it's like meeting someone in their kitchen or in their living room. They give you a different energy, they show you more, they tell you more, you can feel more. And Marc did that with 4 of the CROs that we had within the RFP. Not all of them, the ones that we thought it was valuable to do so with. And it was very valuable, the results that came out of that. We invited 4 companies to bid defense. And out of that bid defense, it's very interesting to be an independent party. So in neither side of the love, I'm not in the triangle, in the love connection. Because I'm not trying to make someone love me, and I'm not trying to choose the best partner. I am standing outside of that. How important that click is, the feeling of I want to climb Mount Everest with you or I don't. And it's something you feel very quickly, I believe, in a room. But it always gets rid of the decision, and that has nothing to do with what's on paper. It has only to do with here. Out of all of those CROs you've met who you know are potentially the right partner, there's a heart personality click that always tends to happen at bid defense. And bid defense being the presentation of the proposal. So the meeting of the team, sometimes you can call it a meet and greet, but traditionally it's called bid defense.
Question mark before that you visited, were they the same before that you invited to the RFP?
No.
So that kind of influence.
Yeah, we actually decided to I think we skipped 1 out of the ones we visited.
Yeah, one of the big ones.
Yeah. And that really was as a result of the, just face-to-face and the atmosphere and the tension, more or less, that you saw between senior project managers and the people who had to do the work. They were really, you saw that they were not comfortable, actually, in addressing the questions that I asked. And yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
So as I just talked about, it sounds kind of floofy. Yay, love and friendly and hippie 1970s. But when we make decisions like this, they're complex, they're incredibly important, especially for smaller biotech companies. It's a make or break. This has to go to getting the right clinical data as quickly as possible, because if it doesn't, the company may not be there anymore. And the cost of redoing everything is astronomical. So what our process is based on is making decisions and being very clear throughout the process. This is what I need. I know that this is best for me. But it's like we know we shouldn't drink, we should sport more, we should not eat fatty foods. We know that, but we don't always feel like it. So why do we have a gym instructor or a partner who reminds us every time that that's necessary? That's the role that Seuss plays in this. But we continue that throughout the process because it starts very in your head, it starts very logically, it starts very non-emotional, and the more going through a process like that, the more emotional it gets. So with this process during the bid defense, which is very much on this side, how scientific, analytical you are, it starts here and it does end up there. Who do I like the best? So in the bid defense, we use individual score sheets that you're not allowed to share with each other, with weighted criteria, which we pull together so that we have a discussion based on the data, the scoring that is based on the selection criteria, which we determined when we were all just busy with this. And we have discussions and use culture formulae to decide to make sure that we're choosing the partner that we all feel are going to climb Mount Everest with us. because there's going to be problems on this road. That's for sure.
Because that's an interesting one. What's also nice about this slide, it's in this order. So you start with your brains and you come up with all the rationale and all the good facts, and then everybody's aligned, and then you have your last, 2 or 3 vendors presenting. And you have your scores, and then even from the scores, it's quite obvious which ones you should go with. But I think we spent a lot, even very late discussions in, but I like them much better. And then we did all the good work up front, and we selected them, and truth be told, I mean, we started off with, 16 realistic CROs. We ended up with 3. In fact, and that's what you told us, in fact, the last 3 are okay. You can work with all 3 of them, and they will do the job, and they can perform based on the rationale, on the facts. And then the last piece, which ones to choose, were really, really difficult, because we had some very, very strongly opinionated people in the room who said, well, I need to work with these people because they're the only group I can work with. And then you think you have organized it very nicely and effectively, and you end up with a question like that, do I like them? But, it ends up being a very, very difficult and very important decision, we found out.
Yeah. So I think the most important thing is to end up with the people you are meeting that they all could do the job. You have to decide whether you want to do it with them. Because there is, as we said, no perfect. You have to identify with this partner, this is your contingency or support planning with that partner, that's what I will need to do. So we have a few minutes quickly left. So Marc's letting me talk about the things that went really well. Because they thought that the things that didn't go well were more fun to talk about. Ugh. The team alignment, I think it's one of the things that we are never brought in actually, or haven't yet been brought in as a consulting company to help because a team is not aligned on that decision, because it's not the thing that actually is felt as the issue, but it is the thing that's most valued. After every selection process, once again they say, actually those kickoff meetings and aligning this team to make this decision together was actually the most valuable outside of all of the work you've taken over. That was very valuable for our team. The critical selection criteria, not just those were headings we showed, but we agreed on what were the measurements, what did we believe would prove that a vendor did have the country coverage, or did have staff satisfaction, or did believe that that was important. And we utilized expert insights. So it was a slide we took out, was we utilized different expertises throughout the organization. Outside of the organization, did reference checks, informal, to make sure we heard as many opinions as possible and insight into our whole process. Were we asking the right questions?
And yes, not everything went ideal, looking back. One thing we clearly, I think, misjudged in the beginning. If you can remember the graph, with high workload from uniQure and then taking over by CROs, it actually means that you have to write down 2 RACEs. So you have to agree on 2 different situations, before dosing, after dosing. So you have a role description up front, and then a very clear role description afterwards. And then imagine that you would have to shift those responsibilities at a certain point in time where people have taken ownership and they know what to do, etc. So I think in reality, it's not really feasible to do a shift in the outsourcing model during study. I mean, there is a clear point when you enter the sort of registry type of phase where you can clearly say, okay, now it's yours. That's fine. But in reality, we found out that it just doesn't stop being a very complicated study after dosing. At least a year afterwards, we need a lot of attention, a lot of micromanagement, a lot of hand-holding also for the CRAs, because they don't have that kind of experience. And truth be told, nobody has that kind of experience, including investigators, hospitals. we found out that we had a huge amount of work in maintaining contact with the pharmacy, for instance, because for the pharmacy, this is really, really tricky. And I imagine, I mean, we're talking about, they were really nervous. I mean, we have, as you maybe know, a product Libera on the market, well, not any longer. But this was around, you know, like 800,000 euros for one dose. And they know that. So they know that the product that they have and that they dose 1 or 2 patients with is worth this kind of money. And then they're very nervous and they keep calling you and they need support, and we had hand holding, almost like a device type of study. So this was sort of a misjudgment, I guess, from our side. Timeline adherence, well, we put it on the negative side, but actually it wasn't that bad. It was bad for Seuss, but it wasn't that bad for uniQure, because we expected it for us to take 3 months from the start to actually finish of the vendor selection, and we ended up with 3.5 months. Well, I think that's pretty good. But that's only because, you know, people in Seuss work day and night almost to get the data done. If we would have done this, if we would have done this in-house, it would definitely have caused some serious delays in selection. So that worked out for us. One thing I think we both agreed on is you saw the funnel when we ended up sending 8 requests for proposals to CROs. That's all nice. I mean, you can send 20 if you want, but you get them back as well. And then you know those people, the CROs, have spent a lot of work on getting these RFPs done. And you can't just read through it or 3 parts of it and then say, well, I don't like it. You have to really go through them structurally. You have to balance it, translate it in Excel spreadsheets, weigh it, score it, etc. And it's just not a good idea to do it with 8 RFPs. Next time we would take probably 4 or something like that, to give you an idea. Yep.
So that was our story. I don't know if anyone has any questions for us. Yeah. Sorry, one microphone.
Thanks.
To share.
I just had one question. At the beginning you mentioned about how you selected, well, my question was, how did you select the cohort originally? What market tool did you use to find the vendor options? Because I know you said you didn't just pick the usual suspects. So I was just curious what tools you used to find those potential partners.
Yeah. Oh, the 150. Well, we initially identified that we needed to have an actual CRO partner, so we needed to have a partner who was on the market, who had a range of offices in different locations. So we took every CRO that has any type of website or online presence, every CRO that we know, we've been working on this for a while, and started with the biggest list possible and funneled with those categories using the simple things, the cuts, the easy ones. So if there was one office in the US that did not have a substantial presence, that was not the partner that was going to be our partner. So slashing down that, going smaller. But then we looked at revenue, of course. So of what remained. We talked about the size does matter. We had good conversation about that. Using the data, this is actually what that means. We talked about reputation and past relationships. So there were some people in the room that said, I don't care what happens, but that cohort of that partner we will never work with. Because we are in a people business as much as we think we're only in science. Some were in the situations of just being merged, just being purchased, or on the market. Is that a partner that for this moment is going to be the most stable partner for uniQure? Those types of things we use to go from the biggest possible number at that moment to the 16 we invited. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just wondered, did you use any particular tool, like Evaluate Pharma or any particular?
We used various tools to get the biggest tools, the biggest list possible. Because what was important to us, since we had not worked with a gene therapy partner yet, is that it wasn't an expertise area of us either. So we wanted to unearth what we didn't know. So for us, it was use every different tool to find that biggest list possible. And then and then filtering out for the types of companies that were irrelevant, just looked relevant because their marketing is off. Yeah. Any other questions? Otherwise, I think we're going to have lunch. I think there's someone excited. Oh.
I'm from the other side. I'm from the vendor side. I work for Covance. But I mean, is this process something that's new? Are companies moving towards this really broad selection? Like what I usually see is, my sponsors have 3 or 4 preferred vendors that they go to. Is this something that's your business model, that you do wide-ranging, or is this kind of like a new trailblazing way of looking at vendor selection?
Yes, of course, because that's much more fun. Do you want to answer, or do you want me to?
I guess your answer is more towards Seuss because it's their sort of search methodology. For us, it was important that clearly we didn't have any preferred providers, so we had to start from scratch. In my previous position in Grünenthal, sure, we had like 3 or 4 preferred providers, and every year, or every second year, we go through a selection phase where we allow other vendors to show what they can. And if they are better than our sort of initial 3, yeah, then we'll just switch them. That was at Grünenthal the situation. For uniQure, that's obviously not the case. I mean, I've shown you how large or small the company is. We wanted actually to move towards a preferred provider. We wanted to move to a outsourcing model with only 1 or 2 vendors, and that's what we still want. But to get there, we needed to do the filtering. And that's what actually Seuss provided. So you're going to use the same vendor for everyone, not this giant selection process? Well, as I mentioned, we're not talking about a 2 or 3 year study. We're bound to each other. I mean, we're sort of committed to each other because of the long-term follow-up commitments. And of course, you can decide to switch halfway study, but that's not what you prefer. Because then you lose efficiency, you lose knowledge, you lose your connection with the sites, etc. So yeah, I mean, we're looking at long-term relationships. It doesn't mean, and that's what we tried to say in the beginning, because it's a platform, it's not one treatment for one study, for one indication, or one patient group. We might end up with another vendor for another. I mean, if we're looking at hemophilia B, if you have a lot of experience as a CRO in hemophilia B, it doesn't mean you have experience in Huntington's. And it's the same platform for us. I mean, it's the same virus, it's the same promoter almost, and then you have your gene package. That's the only difference. So for uniQure, it's almost the same, but you end up in a totally different environment. So yeah, maybe you need, for Huntington's, you would need another vendor, also for 50 years. So.
I think in this case, sorry, just to answer very quickly, in this case we had, for Seuss then, a bit of a Valhalla, more as I just said, we didn't have a knowledge of who were the strongest gene therapy suppliers because we hadn't done that selection. We've just concluded a selection that only included 6 of the top 8 CROs because it's a very specific business model. That company, sponsor, only wants to work with the big CROs. So no need to do a market scan. So it's not a model that it must be this way. And I think for uniQure, it never felt heavy because they didn't do all that work. We did. But it was to make sure that whoever we ended up with really had the strength in the areas that uniQure needed them to. So we had a bit of a gift to do it as expansive as possible, but it's not necessary. But the process that we use to make sure that, because I'm ex-Icon, so I know a lot of the smoke and mirrors that are put up, and I did it myself. So we make sure that taking away of that as much as possible. But I also know the frustration I always felt as a business developer when the sponsor said it must be this way, but it didn't make any sense. I cannot deliver cheaply and quickly and with high quality. I can't. I won't. Or if you ask and they don't really know the answer to the question, or you get 2 very different answers from different decision makers, and I want to win the business, I will figure out an answer to give you. So what the independent role of us is also to be able to say, this isn't going to work. One of you will be disappointed because you don't agree. What is actually the message we're going to tell? And that's where the value is. Is anyone hungry? I have more questions if there are more Anyone else? Otherwise, I'm sure we'll still be around.
Just to uniQure, it's more about long-term. You are talking about long-term studies. So what have you built, maybe at uniQure side, but also from CRO side, to keep that knowledge, to keep this, the work, the spirit of the study during this very long period, 15 years? You know that people will change on both sides. So how do you ensure that you are keeping this, the information, the knowledge, the spirits, the connections with the sites, all of this?
Very good question, and we've been thinking about this. We haven't done it yet, to be honest, because we've just started. So now for everyone, it's just a normal study in the sense that, you know, we're working on it now for half a year, which is usual. I mean, you can manage a 3-year study. But what you said is interesting. Because we were looking at retainment numbers of CRAs, for instance, and then CROs were struggling with the fact, damn, it's a 15-year study. We can't possibly guarantee a 15 years stability, and that's what we didn't ask for. So we worded it exactly like we want to have the same people as much as possible up to the dosing phase. So more or less, you know, 1-2 years. And that's manageable for most CROs. So that's the agreement we had with CROs. The biggest challenge in knowledge retention for us is the regulatory part, is the startup. And of course, we're tracking, we keep documents, we have a sort of lessons learned repository where we store all the questions and the answers from the different authorities that we submitted to. So yeah, probably we're the only company who has that kind of information almost. And although we really wanted CROs to have that kind of information, it's just not there or not comparable. So the information that's quite unique is something that we collect and store. And the rest, well, I guess we have to see in the next few years. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So, Kieran and Marc, thank you so much for the great talk. I'm really talking so loud all the time. Thank you for being here and for all the questions and the participation. So now I think it's time to enjoy lunch. And see you at the next expert track later on.